People like you don't belong here." The words sliced through the velvet air of the Astoria Grand Ballroom. She didn't even see it coming. The wine fell before the laughter did, dark red, rich, and deliberate. It splashed across her hair, her shoulders, her orange dress, spreading in slow motion under the ballroom light. The sound was small, but it was the only one that mattered. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to lips. Every face turned toward the table, where Ava Monroe sat perfectly still, drenched but unflinching. Serena Whitmore stood above her, the empty glass glinting in her hand, her smile sharp enough to cut. "Orange never suited you," she said softly, letting the mockery ride on her breath. A few guests laughed, nervous, eager, pretending to belong. Phones rose like a new kind of chandelier, hungry to capture humiliation. Ava didn't move. She didn't wipe the wine from her collar. She didn't even blink. Her silence spread faster than the stain, filling every corner of the hall. The laughter faltered. Someone gasped. Another lowered their camera, uncertain now who the spectacle truly was. Serena tilted her chin higher, mistaking stillness for surrender. "Smile for the cameras," she whispered, posing beside the woman she thought she'd broken. But the air had already changed. The power in the room was shifting, quietly, invisibly, toward the one who hadn't said a word. Somewhere, a waiter's tray rattled. Somewhere else, a pulse of guilt passed through the crowd. And in the center, Ava Monroe looked up, her eyes calm and heavy with something unspoken. No one knew it yet, but the night had already chosen its queen. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe dignity matters more than arrogance, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. The wine still clung to her skin, dripping steadily onto the linen. Yet Ava Monroe did not stir. She did not wipe her face. She did not reach for a napkin. She simply sat, spine straight, eyes lowered for one beat longer than the room could tolerate. That restraint, so precise, so deliberate, began to feel heavier than any outburst. At first, the silence seemed awkward. A ripple of nervous laughter tried to catch hold, but it fell flat, cut short by the sight of Ava's stillness. Her composure was not passive, it was charged, as if the room itself was bending around her. Each drop of wine that slid from her jaw onto the tablecloth sounded louder, sharper, echoing like a metronome against the brittle laughter of the powerful. A few guests at Serena's side tried to smirk, clapping softly as if encouraging the performance. But even they could feel it. The balance had shifted. The cruelty that had been meant as spectacle was no longer entertaining. Instead, every phone raised, every lens zoomed in, became evidence, recording not Ava's humiliation, but Serena's arrogance. Ava's eyes finally lifted. It was not a frantic glance, not a plea for dignity. It was calculated. She looked first at the empty glass dangling from Serena's manicured fingers, then allowed her gaze to climb slowly, deliberately to Serena's face. The weight of that gaze was immense. It stripped away the laughter. It throttled the noise before it could rise again. Serena tossed her head, forcing another giggle, but her smirk quivered at the edges. She gestured toward the cameras, pretending control. "Smile for the crowd, darling. Show them your best look." Her voice rang high, but it cracked ever so slightly under the pressure of Ava's silence. For the rest of the room, the spectacle was no longer Serena's to own. The woman, drenched in wine, unflinching, unmoved, had become something else entirely. She was no longer the subject of ridicule. She was the center of gravity, pulling every pair of eyes into her orbit. Even those who had laughed moments earlier felt the wrongness in their throats. A woman lowered her phone, cheeks flushed with shame. A man straightened his tie, suddenly aware of how loudly his chuckle had sounded. Ava had said nothing, yet already she had spoken volumes. Whispers began to snake their way through the Astoria Grand Ballroom, coiling like smoke in the air, heavy with crystal and perfume. Some were laced with ridicule, others with unease, but together they revealed the fracture splitting the room. At one end of the table, a group of young heirs leaned back in their tailored suits, grinning with the smugness of men who had never known consequence. One, his cufflinks glittering in the chandelier light, muttered just loud enough for his circle to hear, "She should be grateful. That bottle cost more than her dress. Their laughter came harsh and sharp, desperate to reignite the mood Serena had tried to orchestrate. But not everyone was laughing. A man in a navy pinstripe suit leaned closer to his companion, his voice a tight whisper. That's Ava Monroe. She's the partner from this morning. The ink on the $2.4 billion deal isn't even dry. His companion's jaw tightened, eyes flickering to Serena with something colder than amusement. She doesn't realize what she's just done. The truth began to ripple outward. One investor pressed his lips into a line, suddenly more interested in the screen of his phone than the theatrics. A woman in pearls, who had smirked moments earlier, now shifted uncomfortably, folding her napkin with nervous fingers. The cruel spectacle was losing its audience, and still Ava sat unmoving. Every drop of wine that fell from her sleeve into her lap became a counterpoint to the whispered calculations swirling around her. Her silence was no longer merely composure, it was a mirror. The louder the mockery, the more grotesque it seemed when reflected against her stillness. Serena, oblivious, basked in her own bravado. She raised her empty glass again, curtsying mockingly toward Ava, as if conducting an orchestra of derision. "Cheers to outsiders," she declared. A scattering of chuckles answered, but weaker this time, hollow in the cavernous ballroom. The division was clear. On one side, laughter that rang false, trying to drown unease. On the other, hushed voices, investors and guests who recognized the dangerous undercurrent building beneath the surface. They knew the kind of power Ava Monroe wielded was not the kind that needed an audience. It was the kind that moved markets, signed deals, and destroyed reputations. And in that moment, as the whispers grew louder than the laughter, the room itself seemed to sense it. Serena Whitmore had set a fuse, and the woman she sought to humiliate was the one holding the match. The ballroom throbbed with nervous energy, a pulse no string quartet could mask. Laughter tried to reassert itself, but it was thin now, brittle, like glass stretched too far. And at the center of it all sat Ava Monroe, motionless, commanding, without a word. She shifted slightly, not to wipe away the sticky rivulets of wine soaking into her skin, but to place her hand flat upon the tablecloth. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, yet it landed like a gavel. Guests near her noticed first, glancing down at the elegant hand, steady as marble against the white linen. It was not the movement of a victim, it was the declaration of someone in control, someone anchoring the room. Serena Whitmore, still intoxicated by her own performance, mistook that silence for weakness. With a flourish, she paced the edge of the table, crimson gown sweeping behind her like a trail of fire. She leaned in, her perfume thick in the air, voice dripping with disdain. "How does it feel, Ava, to wear your little orange dress and pretend you belong here?" She tilted her head toward the crowd, feeding them her smirk. "Tell me, everyone, isn't it hilarious? She actually thought she could sit with us." Phones flashed again, but the tone had shifted. What was once eager hunger for humiliation now felt voyeuristic, uncomfortable, like capturing evidence of a cruelty too sharp to justify. One man lowered his phone slowly, guilt pricking the edges of his pride. A woman clutched her champagne flute tighter, knuckles whitening, her laughter faltering mid-breath. And then Ava's eyes rose. The gaze was deliberate, unhurried, cold. She studied Serena, not the way a rival studies an equal, but the way a judge studies someone already condemned. One blink, slow and heavy with the weight of wine on her lashes, became more menacing than any shouted retort. The silence deepened. Even Serena felt it. For the first time, her grin flickered, her giggle stumbled. She tossed her hair, tried to wave the moment away, but the cracks showed. She was performing harder now, louder, desperate to maintain control of an audience that was no longer hers. Ava Monroe did not raise her voice, did not lift her hand beyond that single gesture. Yet the message was unmistakable. There was a storm gathering in her stillness, a storm Serena could not laugh away. The spectacle no longer belonged to the woman in red. It belonged to the woman drenched in crimson wine, who sat unmoved, letting the weight of silence thunder louder than applause. The quartet held a trembling note, and then silence. Ava Monroe did not chase the silence. She owned it. Her fingers, steady against the white linen, relaxed. She reached into her clutch with the same measured grace that had unsettled the room and slid out her phone. No flourish, no drama, only inevitability. Across the table, Serena Whitmore's smile twitched. "Oh, she's calling for help," she cooed, pitching her voice toward nearby cameras. A few obedient chuckles tried to rise, thin and tinny against the weight pressing down on the ballroom. Ava didn't look at Serena. She didn't look at the lenses, the diamonds, or the chandeliers pretending to be constellations. She looked nowhere but the black screen blooming to life in her hand. One tap, another. The call connected. Ava lifted the phone to her ear, the posture of a woman confirming a decision already made. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough to be intimate and clear enough to be absolute. "Terminate the contract. Effective immediately." 5 words. They did not ring. They landed. Heavy, final, irrevocable. The string player's bows hovered in the air and did not move. Glass stems paused mid-clink. Somewhere to the left, a waiter forgot to breathe. There was no second sentence. There didn't need to be. Ava listened for the briefest moment, procedural assent, clean and practiced, then lowered the phone. She set it beside her plate as if laying down a pen after signing her name. The first ripple came from a screen lighting at the far end. An investor blinked, then blanched. Another phone vibrated, then 3, then 10. Push notifications fanned out like sparks across dry brush. Wire alerts, internal memos, market pings. A man in a midnight suit swallowed hard and whispered to no one, "It's real." Serena tried to laugh, the sound too bright, too brittle. "She's bluffing," she announced to the crowd that was no longer hers. No one answered. The silence had changed shape again. No longer tense, no longer performative. It was the sound of consequence crossing a threshold. Ava lifted her water, not wine, and took a small, unhurried sip. The gesture was ordinary. Its message was not. She had not raised her voice. She had adjusted reality. An older guest checked his phone, then another app, then another. His mouth thinned into a line. A younger man, emboldened 5 minutes ago, folded his arms now, suddenly unsure of his place in the scene he had cheered. The word "sell" crackled from somewhere, clipped and urgent, then echoed again from the opposite side of the room, carried on a dozen private calls sprinting toward damage control. Serena stood very straight, as if posture alone could rewind the last 30 seconds. "My brother, our family," she began. The sentence never found its end. Ava didn't grant it one. She simply set her glass down with a soft click that traveled farther than any shout. In the chandelier's glow, the stain on her dress read less like ruin and more like regalia. The first scream didn't come from a throat. It came from a screen. A notification chimed somewhere near the head of the table, followed by a strangled gasp. Then another chime, another gasp. Within seconds, the glow of phones lit the ballroom like a field of fireflies, each one confirming what Serena Whitmore had dismissed as theater. It was not theater. It was fact. "Jesus," someone muttered, scrolling furiously. "She actually pulled it." His voice trembled, raw with disbelief. Another guest clutched his phone to his chest as if shielding himself from impact. Conversations splintered into frantic whispers. Deal sheets, market alerts, private channels lighting up with panic. And at the center, Serena tried to laugh. The sound was shrill, scraping like broken glass across marble. She flung her hair over one shoulder, raised her empty crystal goblet as if she could still command applause. "Oh, come on, you're not really buying this, are you?" she sneered, her voice pitched too high. "She's bluffing. A little drama, a little show. That's all it is." But the room did not laugh with her. Heads were bent toward glowing screens, not her smile. Fingers darted across glass displays, not to applaud but to trade, to dump, to salvage. The sound that filled the ballroom now was not laughter. It was the brittle clatter of panic, the hiss of whispered instructions, the clipped urgency of "sell, now." Serena's eyes darted from one corner to another. Where minutes ago she had basked in the orbit of sycophants, now she saw only profiles turned away. People whispering to one another instead of watching her performance. Her loyal ring of admirers clapped too loudly, too desperately, trying to prop her up with hollow sound. The applause fell flat. Meanwhile, Ava Monroe lifted her glass again, steady as stone. She sipped once, set it down gently, and folded her hands on the table as if presiding over her own court. The stains on her gown no longer read as humiliation. They had become insignia, proof she had endured the assault and turned it into a coronation. A murmur slashed the air like a verdict. "She owns the room?" Serena's throat tightened. Her smirk slipped, cracked, but she forced it wider, straining against the silence that no longer bent to her will. She twirled her empty glass once more, but now it looked less like a scepter and more like a prop. The cracks in her performance had opened, and everyone could see the collapse beginning. The applause meant to rescue Serena withered into silence. The hollow claps, the forced chuckles, all collapsed under the weight of something larger. Ava Monroe finally chose to speak. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words slipped into the hush like drops of iron into water. Quiet, heavy, impossible to ignore. "This room," she began, her tone calm and deliberate, "celebrates wealth, power, legacy." Her gaze swept the table, resting briefly on faces that had laughed only minutes ago. Some lowered their eyes. Others pretended to busy themselves with their screens. "But those things don't live in a glass of wine." She let the sentence hang, and the words found their mark. Serena's crimson gown suddenly seemed garish, her empty goblet ridiculous. "They are not inherited in a laugh," Ava continued, her voice steady, slicing through the quiet. "They are built, they are earned, and above all, they are protected." The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples coursed through the crowd. Investors who had been glued to their phones lifted their eyes. The smirks died. For the first time that night, every ear leaned in, not to Serena's shrill theatrics, but to Ava's composure. Serena tried to interrupt, waving her glass as though she still owned the stage. "She's just performing," she called, voice pitched too high, too brittle. But no one laughed this time. The silence clung stubbornly, obeying Ava. Ava let the interruption pass as if it didn't exist. Then she turned her head, her eyes locking directly onto Serena Whitmore. She held the gaze with surgical precision, the weight of inevitability behind it. And then came the line, measured, cutting, unflinching. "Power doesn't ask for permission." The chandelier above seemed to dim in that instant, or maybe it was just the sharp, collective intake of breath that followed. Chairs creaked as people shifted uneasily. Someone at the far end muttered under his breath, "She's right." Another whispered to his neighbor, "She owns the floor now." Serena's hands shook as she clutched her glass tighter. The audience had turned. The stage, the spotlight, the air itself. None of it belonged to her anymore. It belonged to the woman she had drenched in wine. The words "power doesn't ask for permission" still clung to the crystal air of the ballroom when Serena Whitmore snapped. Her smirk cracked like porcelain dropped on marble. The brittle laugh she tried to conjure broke in her throat, replaced with something raw, something desperate. She slammed her glass onto the table. Hard. The crystal rang out like a gunshot, and dozens of heads jerked in her direction. Her voice, once dripping with arrogance, now shook with fury. "Do you know who I am?" she screamed, her pitch ricocheting off the gilded walls. Her chest rose and fell too fast, her diamond earrings swinging wildly with the movement. "Do you have any idea what family I come from? We built this city. My brother, my name. None of you would be here without us." Her words spilled into the room like shards of glass, cutting but hollow. A murmur rolled across the guests, not in support, but in unease. The name Whitmore, once carried like currency, now clattered uselessly against the weight of what had just unfolded. Investors shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at their phones again, watching billions drain away in real time. And then came Ava Monroe's answer. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. Her reply was quiet, measured, lethal in its simplicity. She turned her head slowly, meeting Serena's wild eyes with unflinching calm. "I don't need to know who you are," she said. The hush tightened around her words, drawing every ear closer. "What matters is who you'll be after tonight." The line dropped into the ballroom like a verdict. Gasps broke through the silence, soft, incredulous, reverent. A woman covered her mouth with her hand. A man at the far end muttered, "God, she's finished." Another leaned to his neighbor, whispering, "No, they're finished." Serena staggered a half step back. For the first time all night, her body betrayed her. The room saw it. They saw the flash of fear in her eyes, the faltering breath, the brittle shield of her family name crumbling to dust. Ava didn't press further. She didn't need to. Her words had already rewritten the hierarchy in the ballroom. The Whitmore name, polished for generations, was unraveling in real time. And as Ava's silence returned, heavier than any speech, the truth crystallized for everyone present. Serena Whitmore no longer defined the room. Ava Monroe did. The moment Ava Monroe's words settled over the ballroom, the soundscape shifted once more. It began with a vibration, one phone, then another, until the entire hall seemed to hum with the chorus of breaking news. Screens lit up like constellations, painting faces in the cold glow of market alerts. "Check the Dow," a man hissed, his voice sharp with panic. "It's tanking. It's really tanking." Another scrolled furiously, sweat beating at his temple. "She pulled out. It's official. 2.4 billion. Gone." His whisper cut through the air like a knife, reaching every ear that strained to listen. The energy in the Astoria Grand Ballroom fractured. Half the guests fumbled with phones, eyes wide as numbers flashed crimson across their screens. The other half sat frozen, caught between disbelief and dread. Conversations no longer drifted in champagne tones. They snapped, terse and urgent. "Sell it all. Call the desk. Get me New York stock right now." At the center of the chaos, Serena Whitmore clung to her collapsing stage. Her smile was gone, replaced by a twisted mask of fury. She raised her empty glass high, as if willing the room back under her control. "This is nonsense," she shouted, voice cracking. "Contracts don't end like that. She doesn't have the power. My family, our name." But no one was listening. Her words dissolved into the frenzy of alerts, into the scrape of chairs as investors leaned into frantic whispers. The Whitmore name, once a crown, now sounded like an empty title. In desperation, Serena slammed the glass against a side table. It cracked at the base, the sharp sound ricocheting through the hall. "You'll regret this," she spat, eyes darting wildly. Yet her fury only underscored her loss. She looked less like a queen in red and more like a performer who had stayed on stage too long after the curtain fell. And then came the counterpoint. Ava Monroe, still seated, still drenched, lifted her chin a fraction. She placed her hands lightly on the table, her posture serene. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence itself had become the verdict. Every vibration of a phone, every notification flashing across a screen, confirmed what her stillness declared. The Whitmores were finished. A murmur spread low and awed. She didn't even raise her voice. Ava's silence was no longer absence. It was a weapon. It was the sentence passed. The ballroom was no longer Serena Whitmore's stage, but she refused to accept it. Her heels struck against the marble as she spun back toward the crowd, her crimson gown swirling around her like a desperate flame trying to devour oxygen that no longer existed. "You all know my family," she shouted, her voice high and raw. She stretched her arms wide, diamonds flashing under the chandelier. "You know my brother. The Whitmores built this city. This," she jabbed a trembling finger toward Ava Monroe, "is nothing but a stunt, a trick meant to humiliate us." Her words, meant to command loyalty, instead fell flat against the walls. The only response was the soft rustle of expensive suits and gowns as guests leaned closer to each other, whispering names, numbers, calculations. The Whitmore name, once carried like a crown, now sounded brittle, unable to stop the steady bleed of billions flashing red across phones. Serena laughed then, sharp and shrill, the sound of glass breaking. She twirled the fractured stem of her glass in her hand, holding it aloft like a scepter. "Look at her," she barked, her voice cracking under the weight of hysteria. "She thinks she can erase us. She thinks she can sit in this room, in our city, and destroy what we built." But the audience was no longer hers. Heads turned, yes, but not to affirm her. They turned to Ava, to the woman seated calmly in the orange gown soaked in crimson wine, hands folded, eyes serene, as if every drop staining her fabric had been transformed into a metal. The shift was unmistakable. Investors no longer disguised their calculations. They spoke openly now. The deal is dead. She pulled out with one call. This is history. Each phrase carried further than Serena's desperate cries. Ava did not respond. She didn't need to. Her stillness had become magnetic, pulling every gaze, every thought, every calculation toward her. Serena's voice was nothing but static against the roar of silence, Ava commanded. One guest whispered what many already knew. She owns the room now. And in that moment, Serena's grand performance, designed to humiliate, collapsed into farce. Her words had lost their currency. Her name had lost its weight. The only thing that mattered now was Ava Monroe and the quiet, devastating power she carried without raising her voice. Serena Whitmore's laugh rang out again, but this time it was thinner, hollower, a sound trying and failing to mask the tremor rising in her chest. She tossed her hair back with exaggerated force, but the movement betrayed her. Her hands shook. The once flawless poise of Manhattan's most photographed heiress had shattered, replaced by brittle theatrics that no longer convinced even her closest sycophants. Don't be fooled, she declared, spinning in place as though movement alone could keep the spotlight from slipping away. She's bluffing. This is all a performance. She doesn't have the power. She can't. The words choked in her throat, unfinished, strangled by the weight pressing down from every corner of the ballroom. Around her, the guests did not answer. Their silence was sharper than any jeer. A man in a tailored navy suit slipped his phone into his pocket, unwilling to record Serena's unraveling any longer. A woman who had laughed earlier now bit her lip, eyes fixed firmly on her champagne as if ashamed of her own cruelty. The spotlight, no longer shining from chandeliers or cameras, had shifted to Ava Monroe. Ava sat perfectly still, her hands folded lightly atop the table, her chin lifted with quiet authority. The wine-soaked gown that moments ago had been intended as ridicule now clung to her like regalia, crimson streaks glowing under the golden light. She was drenched, yes, but drenched in power. Every gaze gravitated toward her. The hush she commanded wasn't fragile, it was sovereign. Even those who had mocked her now leaned forward slightly, drawn not by pity but by awe. They were watching something irreversible, humiliation being transfigured into dominance before their eyes. Serena forced another laugh, louder, sharper, cracking at the edges. She raised her fractured glass as if daring the crowd to cheer, but no applause came. Instead, a ripple of whispers circled the room like a verdict being sealed. She's finished. No, her family's finished. Serena heard it. Her eyes flickered wildly, darting from one guest to the next, searching for allegiance. None came. The sycophants who had once laughed too loudly now stared at the floor, unwilling to meet her gaze. And through it all, Ava Monroe remained unshaken, her silence heavier than stone, her presence shaping the room as surely as gravity shapes orbits. For Serena, the cracks of fear had become visible. For Ava, the crown of power had already settled on her head. Serena Whitmore's voice clawed at the edges of the ballroom, too high, too desperate. You're all fools if you believe her, she shrieked, spinning to face the crowd. She can't erase the Whitmores. She doesn't have the reach, the influence, the legacy. My family made this city what it is. Her declaration rang out, but instead of applause, the only answer was the glow of phones and the rustle of hushed conversations. 100 faces, once turned eagerly toward her, now angled away. People whispered into their screens, trading numbers, speaking names, making calls. The Whitmore dynasty was dissolving in real time, and no one wanted to be caught applauding its fall. Serena's laugh tore through the air, brittle and jagged. She lifted her fractured crystal glass as though it were still a scepter, shaking it toward the audience. Look at her! She's nothing! She's drenched in wine, humiliated, powerless. The words felt hollow even as she said them, drowned by the murmurs flooding around her. Because across the table, Ava Monroe had not moved. Her stillness was monumental. She sat with her chin lifted, eyes calm, hands resting on the table as though carved from stone. The red stains on her gown had become emblems, no longer signs of ridicule, but symbols of endurance and defiance. And the room saw it. They saw the transformation. She's not powerless, whispered a man near the head of the table, his tone almost reverent. She just moved billions with a sentence. A woman in pearls nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on Ava. And she's done more with silence than Serena has with all her shouting. The tide was undeniable. What had begun as an assault was now a trial, and the ballroom had become a tribunal. Serena was on the stand, her shrieks a testimony against herself. Ava, silent, unflinching, presided as judge without ever leaving her chair. Every nervous whisper was a gavel strike. Every glance toward Ava was a vote. The verdict was forming, not in words but in the room's collective turn. Serena could not see it, or perhaps refused to. She spun, red silk snapping like a banner of defiance, her voice cracking as she bellowed, "Do you hear me? We are untouchable." But the silence that followed was heavier than stone. The Whitmores were no longer untouchable. Everyone knew it, everyone but Serena. And at the heart of it all, Ava Monroe's silence reigned supreme. Serena Whitmore's laughter rang out again, brittle and manic, bouncing off the marble walls like the cry of a bird trapped in a gilded cage. She twirled, her crimson dress flaring around her, as if the movement itself could conjure back the audience she had lost. "Don't you see?" she called, her voice pitched too high. "This is all theater, a stunt. You can't let her fool you." But the words fell into a void. No applause followed. No chuckles rose to meet her. The crowd's silence was not polite, it was damning. People leaned closer to one another, whispering urgently about markets, about consequences, about futures that had just evaporated. Their eyes slid past Serena as though she were invisible, landing instead on the wine-soaked woman seated in unshaken stillness. Ava Monroe had not moved. She had not spoken since her last words, but her presence had expanded to fill the hall. Her calm composure bent the air, reshaped the rhythm of the room. She sat like a queen upon her throne, a judge presiding over a trial she hadn't called, and the jury, every guest present, was delivering its verdict silently, collectively, without needing to say a word. Serena, blind to the shift, pressed on. She lifted her fractured glass high, trying to turn it into a trophy. "Smile for the cameras," she shouted, forcing her lips into a wide grin. The flash of phones answered her, but not as she intended. They were not capturing her triumph. They were immortalizing her collapse. One young man lowered his camera mid-recording, shame written across his face. A woman beside him shook her head. "This is ugly," she whispered. Her companion nodded grimly, eyes fixed on Ava. "It's over." Serena's laugh faltered then, catching in her throat. She spun again, arms wide, hair tossing dramatically, but the performance rang hollow. Her movements no longer commanded attention. They begged for it. The silence that followed pressed harder, suffocating, undeniable. And through it all, Ava Monroe remained silent. Each second of her stillness was another gavel strike. Each calm blink, another sentence passed. She didn't need to condemn Serena. The room was doing it for her. By the time Serena stopped spinning, breathless and trembling, the verdict was clear. The heiress had lost the crowd. The jury had turned, and Ava, without uttering a word, had already won. Serena Whitmore refused to surrender, though every signal in the room told her the stage was no longer hers. She lifted her chin high, forcing her lips into a brittle smile. "Don't be shy, everyone," she called out, twirling her crimson dress as if the spin could hypnotize the crowd back into her orbit. "Take a good look. This is what happens when you climb too high. Outsiders should know their place." The words rang out, sharp and venomous, but they echoed without resonance. Instead of laughter, the ballroom answered with silence, an oppressive, watching silence that seemed to swallow Serena whole. A few of her companions tried to clap politely, but their applause was scattered, hesitant, evaporating almost as soon as it began. The cracks in her confidence widened, and the room could see it. She tried again, pacing the length of the table like a performer on Broadway who had missed her cue. "Look at her!" Serena sneered, gesturing wildly toward Ava Monroe, still drenched in wine. "She doesn't belong here. She'll never belong here." But her insults only made the contrast sharper, because Ava did not flinch. She remained seated, poised, her silence resonating louder than Serena's screams. Every guest could feel it now, the gravitational pull of Ava's stillness. She had become the center of the room, the eye of the storm, unshakable and commanding without a single word. A man near the back of the hall whispered to his wife, his voice low but urgent. "She's not the victim anymore. She owns this room." His wife nodded, her eyes never leaving Ava. And Serena doesn't even realize she's already lost. The heiress spun once more, diamonds flashing, her laughter pitched higher, more desperate. But it sounded hollow, a performance with no audience. Guests leaned away, their gazes pulled inexorably toward Ava. Even the phones still recording shifted their frames, centering not on Serena's theatrics, but on the quiet queen at the table. The shift was complete. Serena was still moving, still shouting, still fighting for relevance. But the room no longer revolved around her. It revolved around Ava Monroe, silent, unflinching, immovable. And that silence was more commanding than any crown Serena had ever tried to wear. The ballroom trembled with the emptiness of Serena Whitmore's words. Her shrill laughter, her twirls, her frantic declarations had become echoes bouncing against walls that no longer cared to listen. Every camera lens, every pair of eyes, every thought was fixed not on her, but on the woman she had tried to destroy. Ava Monroe moved at last. It was not a dramatic gesture, not the explosive rebuttal the crowd had expected. She reached calmly for the stem of her glass, the one untouched until now, still half full, its surface glimmering beneath the chandelier's golden light. Her fingers curled around it with measured grace. She lifted it slowly, deliberately, as if every second of the motion were a command. The room leaned forward without realizing. Even the quartet in the corner, bows suspended, watched as though awaiting their cue. Serena's voice cracked in the background, another hollow declaration, but it fell flat, drowned beneath the anticipation building in the silence. Ava raised the glass to her lips. She sipped once, calm, unhurried, regal. The crimson wine slid across her tongue, a mirror of the crimson stains streaking her gown. And then she lowered the glass back to the table. Click. The soft sound of crystal kissing linen was not loud, yet it cut sharper than Serena's screams. It echoed, reverberated, sinking into the marrow of the ballroom. It was the punctuation to a sentence Serena had never realized she was writing, the final mark of authority. A murmur rippled across the guests, hushed but undeniable. "That sound," one man whispered, "spoke louder than everything she said tonight." Another replied, "She didn't need to raise her voice. She just closed the argument." Serena froze. Her lips parted as if to unleash another retort, but no sound came. For the first time, she seemed to recognize that she was no longer the performer, no longer the center. She was an afterthought, a shadow. Ava Monroe, drenched in wine, silent but sovereign, had seized the stage with nothing more than a sip and a quiet click of glass. And in that instant, the hall itself bowed to her authority. The soft click of Ava Monroe's glass still lingered in the air, echoing louder than any scream. The ballroom was heavy with awe, but Serena Whitmore refused to accept it. She drew in a ragged breath, her chest heaving beneath the crimson silk, and forced her voice out like a whip. "Do you know who we are?" she demanded, the words tearing at her throat. "We are the Whitmores. My family's name is carved into this city, our towers, our banks, our foundations. You all owe everything to us." Her declaration rang through the hall, but instead of awe, it was met with blank stares and lowered eyes. The same name that once opened doors and commanded obedience now sounded like an empty relic, a brittle echo of a dynasty unraveling before everyone's eyes. Some guests exchanged glances. A man in a dark suit whispered hoarsely, "That name doesn't mean what it used to." His companion nodded grimly, tapping at a phone that glowed blood red with stock alerts. "It's not power anymore. It's just history." Serena heard the whispers. She swung around wildly, her earrings catching the light in a desperate sparkle. "Don't you dare forget who built this city. Don't you dare turn your backs on us," she shouted, her voice cracking. But the crowd had already turned. Literally. Faces angled toward Ava. Cameras focused on her. Lenses drinking in her silence, her poise, her composure. She hadn't said another word, hadn't lifted a hand since placing her glass down. Yet she filled the room with a command Serena could not imitate. A woman in pearls leaned toward her husband, her voice barely above a breath. She's not just surviving this, she's rewriting it. Her husband nodded, awe flickering in his eyes. The Whitmores are finished. Ava's the one holding the pen now. Serena tried again, forcing a brittle laugh. She can't erase us. She can't. Do you hear me? She can't. But the plea rang hollow. It sounded less like defiance and more like desperation, a drowning woman clinging to a name that no longer kept her afloat. And at the center, Ava Monroe remained immovable, wine-soaked, regal, untouchable. She was no longer defending herself. She was presiding. For Serena, the Whitmore legacy had become a shield made of glass, already cracked, already splintering. And the ballroom, this silent tribunal, was watching it shatter. Serena Whitmore's voice was unraveling. The once polished tone of Manhattan's social elite now cracked under the strain, high-pitched and frantic. Her words spilled over one another as if volume could repair what had already been lost. "You can't just end us!" she screamed, her voice breaking on the last word. "Contracts don't work like that. Deals don't just disappear. You think you can walk in here, sit at our table, and undo generations? Do you hear me? Do you hear me?" But her shouts, flung desperately into the air, met only silence. The audience wasn't hers anymore. Investors didn't look up. Phones buzzed with alerts, glowing red with falling numbers. Faces were turned away, angled instead toward the woman seated in stillness. A woman who had not shouted, had not begged, had not moved beyond the measured grace of her posture. Ava Monroe. She sat upright, her gown heavy with crimson stains, but her expression unshaken, serene. She let Serena's screams bounce against the marble, let them scatter like broken glass across the hall. Then when the silence became unbearable again, she lifted her eyes. The gaze was slow, deliberate. It found Serena, pinned her in place, and held her there. The room seemed to stop breathing, and when Ava spoke, her words were soft, steady, devastating. "Power," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the hall, "doesn't ask for permission." The line fell like a stone into water, sending ripples through the crowd. Guests shifted in their seats, their whispers hushed. The sentence was not loud, but it carried a weight Serena's screaming could never match. It was the kind of line that would be quoted in boardrooms tomorrow, written into headlines before dawn. A man near the center exhaled sharply. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the truth." His companion nodded, his eyes locked on Ava. "She owns the room, completely." Serena's face drained of color. Her glass trembled in her hand, a fragile prop for a performance no one believed in anymore. She opened her mouth to shout again, but no words came, because Ava had already defined the battlefield, and in that single sentence, she had claimed victory. John 18, panic in red. The echo of Ava Monroe's words. "Power doesn't ask for permission," still hummed in the air when Serena Whitmore broke. Her voice, once sharp with arrogance, now cracked like shattered crystal. "No!" she shrieked, stomping her heel against the marble floor, the sound sharp but pitiful. "You don't understand. None of you understand. My family owns this city. The Whitmore name, our towers, our banks, our blood. It's all built into these walls." Her hands trembled as she raised her fractured glass again, as if the fragile stem could still anchor her authority. But no one believed her anymore. The crowd had shifted. They were no longer witnesses to a performance. They were jurors at a reckoning. Heads bowed slightly, not in submission to Serena, but in quiet acknowledgement of Ava's dominance. Phones glowed faintly in their laps, screens filled with collapsing numbers and news alerts confirming the end of the Whitmore deal. A man whispered urgently to his companion, "It's over. She just wiped billions with one call." His companion, a woman in a silk dress, nodded, her eyes fixed on Ava. "That's what real power looks like." Serena's laugh burst out again, high and brittle, startling even herself. She tried to spin in her gown, tried to mimic the grandeur of minutes before, but the gesture was hollow. No applause followed, no laughter echoed back. She was a dancer twirling on an empty stage, her music silenced. Meanwhile, Ava remained motionless. Her eyes calm, her hands folded, she sat like a monument of unshakable truth. Every whisper in the hall orbited her now. Every glance landed on her. She did not chase attention. It was gravity itself that pulled the room toward her. Serena's voice grew hoarse as she shouted again. She can't erase us. Do you hear me? She can't. But the desperation in her tone betrayed her. Even the most loyal faces in the crowd looked away, ashamed to be associated with the spectacle. The more Serena screamed, the smaller she became. And across the table, Ava Monroe's silence towered larger, heavier, an unspoken truth that the Whitmore legacy had ended tonight in full view of the city's elite. Serena Whitmore's voice was nearly gone. The shrieks that had once cut through ballrooms now scraped raw against her throat, hoarse and desperate. "Don't look at her," she cried, her words breaking, brittle as glass. "Look at me. I'm a Whitmore. You all know my brother. You know our name." Her hands shook violently as she gestured to the crowd, but the glass slipped slightly in her grip, threatening to shatter like the illusion she clung to. No one moved. The ballroom answered her, not with cheers, not with applause, but with silence. The most punishing silence of her life. Guests shifted in their seats, but their eyes refused to follow her. They glanced down at glowing screens, at crumbling numbers, at headlines already racing across financial networks. They whispered to one another, their voices low and reverent, all orbiting the woman Serena had tried to humiliate. Ava Monroe. She did not shout. She did not gloat. She made no grand declarations. Instead, she moved with disarming simplicity. One hand rose, slow and steady, until her fingers brushed against her jaw. She rested her chin lightly upon it, her gaze fixed directly on Serena. It was not a glare. It was not even defiance. It was judgment. That small gesture carried the weight of a crown. The room felt it instantly. The hush deepened, sharp as a gavel strike. A man at the far end of the table murmured to his companion, "She doesn't need words anymore. She's already judged her." The woman beside him nodded, eyes wide. "And the rest of us, we've already agreed with the verdict." Serena froze under Ava's gaze. For all her screaming, her stomping, her desperate twirls in crimson silk, she now looked like a child chastised before the class. Her eyes darted wildly from guest to guest, searching for an ally, but no one met her look. Even her most loyal followers studied their champagne, unwilling to be dragged down with her. And across from her, Ava Monroe's stillness became monumental. With her chin resting lightly on her hand, she looked less like a woman who had been drenched in wine and more like a sovereign presiding over her court. In that moment, the hierarchy was rewritten. Serena was no longer an heiress. She was a spectacle. Ava was the authority. The silence was suffocating, and for the first time in her gilded life, Serena Whitmore felt small. Her voice rasped as she forced out another cry. "This isn't over. Do you hear me? None of you would be here without us." But the words sounded like echoes from a forgotten era, powerless, drained of the command they once carried. Her heels struck the marble as she paced frantically, the crimson gown trailing behind her, like the remnants of a fire smothered by ash. She lifted her fractured glass one last time, but her grip faltered. The crystal slipped from her fingers, striking the edge of a side table before tumbling to the floor in two sharp pieces. Gasps rippled through the hall, not of awe but of finality. Serena's mask cracked completely. She spun toward the exit, red silk clinging to her trembling frame, her breath shallow, uneven. "You'll regret this," she shouted, though her voice broke halfway through, carrying no weight, only desperation. No one stopped her. No one pleaded for her to stay. Instead, the guests parted without a word, their movements instinctive, creating a clear path across the ballroom. She stormed toward the double doors, her heels clicking too quickly, betraying panic instead of poise. Each step echoed not as dominance, but as retreat. And at the center of the hall, Ava Monroe did not rise. She remained seated, chin resting lightly on her hand, her silence heavier than any declaration Serena could ever scream. She watched, unblinking, regal, as the woman in red stumbled out, leaving behind a trail of arrogance shattered into fragments. The doors closed behind Serena with a hollow thud that reverberated through the golden chamber. The sound was final, like the last note of a requiem. The room exhaled as one. Whispers resumed, But they no longer spoke of Serena or her family. They spoke of Ava. Investors leaned close, murmuring calculations. Journalists typed furiously on glowing screens. One guest whispered to another, "She owns the room. She owns the story. She owns tonight." Ava's stillness anchored it all. She had not lifted her voice, had not even risen from her seat. Yet she sat enthroned, the undeniable sovereign of the evening. And in Serena's retreat, Ava Monroe's victory was sealed, not with spectacle, but with silence. The echo of the closing doors still lingered when the ballroom shifted. It was as if the very air had realigned, no longer tethered to the Whitmore name, but drawn instead to the quiet figure seated at the center table. Ava Monroe had not moved, yet she had become the axis around which every thought, every whisper, every calculation now revolved. Guests who had moments earlier clapped for Serena now avoided even mentioning her name. A man in a tailored charcoal suit leaned to his companion, his voice hushed but urgent. 2.4 billion gone in an instant, he said, shaking his head. She didn't just pull the plug on a deal, she pulled the plug on a dynasty. His companion, eyes never leaving Ava, murmured back, and she did it without standing up. The investors were no longer subtle. Phones lit up across the hall as calls were made, numbers recalculated, loyalties redrawn. Deals that once orbited the Whitmore fortune now shifted toward Ava, her silence more persuasive than any contract clause. A woman in emerald silk clutched her champagne flute, her gaze fixed reverently on Ava. "She owns the narrative," she whispered. Her husband, adjusting his cuff links nervously, nodded. "And the future. Every headline tomorrow will have her name." The quartet in the corner still hadn't resumed their music. Their bows hovered above strings, waiting, waiting for Ava, as though the authority to continue lay only with her. And Ava? She remained composed, her gown heavy with crimson stains that looked less like humiliation and more like battle honors. She did not smile. She did not bask. She simply observed, her eyes moving slowly across the hall, meeting gazes one by one. Each person who felt her look faltered, lowering their eyes, acknowledging silently what no one dared to contest. She was in command. The Astoria Grand Ballroom no longer belonged to Serena Whitmore or her family's legacy. Tonight, it belonged entirely to Ava Monroe. The ballroom had fallen into a new rhythm, no longer frantic, no longer mocking. It pulsed instead with low voices, quickened breaths, and the glow of screens. The air was thick with the realization that what had unfolded was not merely scandal, not merely spectacle, but history. At one corner of the table, a man scrolled through his phone, his face draining of color. "It's real," he muttered. "The stock dropped 6 points in under an hour. The deal's gone. 2.4 billion erased." His words spread quickly, like sparks leaping from one guest to another. Within moments, entire clusters of people were whispering, their tones hushed, reverent, edged with fear. Across the hall, a journalist disguised as a socialite furiously typed on her glowing screen. The headline was already forming, "CEO destroys Whitmore contract in real time." Her fingers trembled as she added, "Ballroom witnesses empire collapse." She wasn't writing gossip, she was writing the first draft of history. A woman in pearls leaned close to her husband, her voice barely audible. "We'll be reading about this for decades." He nodded gravely, his eyes fixed on Ava Monroe. "And telling our grandchildren we were in this room when it happened." Even the staff, the waiters holding silver trays, the musicians clutching their bows, seemed frozen in place, as if aware that any movement might break the spell of the moment. The quartet had lowered their instruments entirely now, their silence a tribute to the gravity of what had just occurred. Meanwhile, Ava sat still, her wine-soaked gown glowing under the chandeliers like a crown forged in fire. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken since her last devastating line. Yet she didn't need to. The hall itself was speaking for her, the whispers, the phones, the headlines waiting just beyond those gilded doors. Every guest understood the truth. This was not the night the Whitmores triumphed. It was the night they fell. And it was Ava Monroe's silence that had toppled them. The whispers had shifted. They no longer carried numbers or panic. They carried reverence. The ballroom, once echoing with cruel laughter, now murmured with awe for the woman who had sat drenched in wine yet unmoved, and in that stillness dismantled an empire. Guests stole glances at Ava Monroe, as if daring to look directly at her for too long might expose their own complicity in Serena Whitmore's cruelty. Some lowered their eyes the moment Ava's gaze swept past them, as though they had been judged and found wanting. Others leaned forward almost unconsciously, their bodies tilting toward her like plants bending toward sunlight. "She owns this room," whispered a silver-haired banker, his voice barely audible, his head bowed slightly. Beside him, a woman nodded, clutching her clutch to her chest. "No, she owns the city now." Even those who had mocked her earlier, those who had clapped at Serena's theatrics, who had laughed when the wine first poured, now sat rigid with shame. Their silence was a confession, their stillness an apology. No one dared to sneer anymore. Across the room, an investor typed frantically into his phone. He wasn't recording Serena's collapse. He was sending a message to his board. "Monroe is the future." A line immediately. The transformation was complete. Ava was no longer the outsider humiliated in orange silk. She had become the axis of power in the ballroom, the gravitational center that pulled everyone into her orbit. The quartet still hadn't resumed playing, but they didn't need to. The hall was already filled with its own music, the sound of hushed reverence, the rhythm of glasses lowered in respect, the pulse of history being written in whispers. Ava lifted her gaze once more. Not hurried, not dramatic, simply steady. And the room responded instinctively. Heads dipped, eyes lowered. It was not fear that guided them, it was recognition. Recognition that they were no longer witnessing a scandal. They were witnessing a coronation. The Astoria Grand Ballroom felt changed, as though the very air had been rewritten. The cruel spectacle that had begun with spilled wine was gone, erased by a silence that now hummed with recognition. What remained was something heavier, something lasting, the knowledge that they had all witnessed a shift in power that could not be undone. The guests no longer whispered Serena Whitmore's name. Her retreat had dissolved into memory the moment the doors closed. Instead, the murmurs spoke only of Ava Monroe. "What happens tomorrow?" a hedge fund director muttered to his colleague, eyes wide on his glowing phone. "The markets will bleed." "They already are," came the grim reply. "But by Monday morning, every paper will have her face on it, and every boardroom will be asking the same question. How do we stand with her?" At another table, a woman in emerald silk sighed, almost reverently. "She didn't raise her voice once. That's what terrifies me." Her husband exhaled. "No," he corrected softly. "That's what crowns her." And through it all, Ava remained seated, her gown still clinging to her in crimson stains that no one dared call humiliation anymore. They looked like regalia. Marks of fire survived, a coronation robe painted in defiance. She had spoken less than a dozen sentences that night, but each had bent the room to her will. Finally, she rose. The movement was slow, unhurried, yet it rippled across the ballroom like thunder. Chairs scraped back as some instinctively stood with her, not out of duty but out of awe. The quartet lowered their bows entirely, their silence absolute, as though music itself had no authority compared to hers. Ava walked toward the doors, each step deliberate, measured. Guests shifted aside like courtiers making way for their sovereign. No one blocked her path. No one dared. At the threshold, she paused. She turned once, not to the empty space where Serena had collapsed into fury, not to the shattered glass on the marble floor, but to the people themselves. Her eyes swept over them, calm and unwavering. And then, without a word, she stepped into the night. Behind her, the silence of the ballroom did not fade. It deepened, heavy with awe, heavy with the certainty that this night would not be forgotten. Outside the Astoria Grand, the city pulsed, unaware that its balance of power had just shifted inside those gilded walls. But by dawn, every headline would scream the truth. Black CEO erases $2.4 billion deal in real time. Witnesses call it a night of reckoning. Ava Monroe redefines power. Markets rippled before midnight. Futures bled red as alerts cascaded across phones and taxis, penthouses, and trading floors. The Whitmore dynasty, once untouchable, was already being dissected by analysts who had no mercy for arrogance. Stock tickers rolled, and the name Whitmore was no longer a crown. It was a liability. And yet, amid the chaos, one name rose higher, repeated in whispers and awe. Ava Monroe. Guests who had once mocked her were already rewriting their narratives. At charity galas and private clubs, they would say, "I was there. I saw her do it." Investors scribbled notes, adjusting strategies to align with her. Journalists prepared op-eds on dignity, power, and what it meant when a black woman dismantled an empire with silence in 5 words. But the most powerful change was not in headlines or tickers. It was in memory. Those who sat in that ballroom would never forget the moment the laughter died, the phones lit up, and the woman drenched in wine refused to bow. They would carry it like a story etched into the marrow of the city. The night dignity stood taller than legacy, and silence thundered louder than money. For Ava Monroe, this was not revenge. It was revelation. She had not shouted. She had not begged. She had not demanded. She had simply reminded the room and the world that true power does not perform. True power decides. And tonight she had decided. If you were watching, what would you have done in that ballroom? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. More untold stories of dignity, justice, and power are coming.